Now we're going to go into a space for the entrepreneurial journey where we talk about purpose. And this can become a little overwhelming because a lot of people feel like they've got to find their purpose and define their purpose, and you think sometimes it's going to come and hit you over the head. And when I met our next speaker, she was somebody to me that right away I could figure out that she not only had found her purpose, but she was living it, and it was real. It wasn't just talk. And her energy, her enthusiasm, it was authentic, it was contagious. But what I was most impressed about her and why I wanted her here tonight is because she wasn't afraid to find it, try different things. She started as a stage actress and then was an attorney, professional speaker, a business strategist, and not somebody who was all over the board. She was successful at every single one of these. I can't think of a better example to talk about this tonight. Here's a little bit more about her. Get on your feet!
I love this. This actually reminds me of my days growing up on stage. You can't see the audience. All the little kids used to ask me when I would perform, "Lisa, don't you get nervous?" And I'd say, "No, you can't see anyone. There's really no one there." Yes, so I had my sights set on Broadway from probably about 4 years old. And I grew up on stage as what they call a triple threat. And for those of you that are not familiar with the theater world, that is known as someone that's a singer, actress, and dancer. And I just decided at a very young age that I was going to be on Broadway. The problem, there are a few of them, and we'll go over those, but one of the problems was that I grew up in an Italian-American family in New York that did not have a lot of money. In fact, not only did they not have a lot of money, they didn't really have a little money. And so one of the issues became, how will you support yourself if you go do this career? I think what my parents saw was starving actress waiting tables, because that's what happened to most people that didn't make it on Broadway. They did have a lot of faith in my talent. They drove me to rehearsals. They were very, very supportive. But they started saying things like, "You know, Lisa, you have opportunities. You're really smart. You have a brain." And I always found that interesting, and as the years went on and I would perform, and now I still perform to this day in community and regional theater, and I think about that, wow, so you don't use your brain when you're on stage? So all of the lines that you learn and the choreography that you learn in practice, connecting with the audience, connecting with the people that you're on stage with, researching a role, basically you turn your brain off. So I always found that a little interesting. But the reason was that most people project their own fears, including your own parents. They were coming from their own background, especially my mother, grew up in an Italian family as the only female, and basically, if there was any money, the oldest male would go to college and that was about it. And she was extremely bright, and that was what she wanted for her future. So for me, she very much had decided that because I was excelling in school and I was really a little smarty pants, that I would go on and pursue an education, and that meant being something like a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, something like a profession. And so she started saying to me, "You know, why don't you just think about a fallback career?" So I did. I started thinking about, what could I do as a fallback? And I thought, and when I was about 14 years old, I took a class in high school. In my high school, they offered a class called law. And it was really exciting. And there was mock trial, and it was really interesting. And then I went to Hofstra University in Long Island, where I wound up going to college eventually. And I was there actually for a Shakespeare festival, because I was still pursuing my acting. and I found out they had a great pre-law department. And I decided that my fallback career would be becoming a lawyer. Because isn't that what everyone does as a fallback? Yeah, nothing like taking the hard road. So basically that meant an all-consuming, time-consuming, expensive fallback career. And you can probably imagine what happened from that point on. When I was about 18, I made a very difficult decision that I would actually not pursue theater as a career path, but that I would keep it as a wonderful hobby the rest of my life. If you've ever read the book, The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, it's a great book, by the way, I highly recommend it. She talks about how within many of us, we have an art. And she doesn't necessarily mean painting or, for me, performing. It's that thing that's deep within you that permeates and integrates and infiltrates everything else you do. And often, for many of us, we're actually teased about it as we're growing up. So, you might tease Alex because he's the class clown and he becomes a comedian. And Sharon is told, put your hand down, let someone else answer a question, and now she's leading a major corporation. Well, for me, it was always, Lisa, stop talking. Lisa, be quiet. Mrs. Montanaro, Lisa is a pleasure to have in class. She gets along well with others. She's extremely intelligent. If we could just get her to stop talking. And it went on like that for a while. And what I find interesting when I look back now over my many careers and callings is that this type of art was always coming out. And it was speaking, performing, communicating in some way. For several years, I taught and interpreted at the New York School for the Deaf while I was going to law school in the evening. And people would tease me that knew me growing up because now I was speaking with my hands. And I like to laugh because, I grew up thinking I was a triple threat, which meant singer, actress, and dancer, but really the triple threat was if you came near me, I'm Italian, I'm from New York, and I'm fluent in sign language. So it's actually dangerous to be near me when I'm speaking. So that's the real triple threat. If you know the famous researcher Jane Goodall, you probably are familiar with the fact that she spent her life studying chimpanzees and their behavior, and her research has helped not only that community, but also humans. She said something years and years ago that resonated with me. She said, what you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. And I thought that the difference that I would make in the beginning was the path of Broadway and connecting with people through performing. Then when I became a lawyer, I thought the difference that I would make was saving the world. Little did I know, once I started practicing law, that the world didn't want to be saved. What the world really wanted to do, unfortunately, through lawyers, was fight. And this went against everything that my purpose stood for. In about, actually I'm not going to tell you the year because then I'll give away my age. But many, many years ago, I was a first-generation college student. And for those of you that don't know what that means, I was the first one in my family to go to college. Then I went on to law school. And of course, my parents were really proud at this point. And I didn't just go to law school. I went to law school and I did everything you're supposed to do. I made law review. I published my law review article. I went and got a summer associate position at one of the large Manhattan firms. I got an offer to come back, and then I accepted that offer. And there I was, all of a sudden, at 30 Rock. Yes, the 30 Rock that the television show is in now. And I was this attorney, young attorney, making a six-figure salary in a family where I grew up with not a lot of money. And there's a little bit of power and sexiness in that. So in the beginning, I think I sort of got sucked into that, like, oh, look at me. I'm in this law firm now. I get to wear suits every day, and I make good money. Problem. I went into law thinking that that would be a way to be able to have opportunities and to not have a financial problem. I came out of law school with $80,000 in student loans. So lo and behold, all of a sudden, I really wasn't that rich. I might have made a lot of money, but there was a lot of money going back to Uncle Sam, which was called the Stafford loan, to pay back my loans. And so I started feeling trapped in this type of environment and that I wasn't really going to be able to make a difference. Ironically, I loved law school. I should have known at that point that there was something wrong because no one really likes law school. They all love practicing law when they get out, but no one likes law school. I loved researching it, writing it, debating about it. I loved everything about it. I eventually wound up teaching law school for 2 years as an adjunct, and I loved that also. but I couldn't stand the way it was practiced. It was extremely negative. And Lily Tomlin, that wise woman, once said that the problem with the rat race is that even if you win, you're still a rat. And I started to feel like that rat or hamster on a wheel. So there I was, working 90-plus hours a week in Manhattan at this law firm, and it occurred to me at one point that my office was like a bunker. So there were a number of suits hanging at the back of the door. There were extra pantyhose and undergarments, and the drawers were stuffed with soup cans and granola bars. I mean, you could have spent a lot of time in there, which unfortunately I did. And at one point I realized that I had worked 37 days straight with no time off, and that I had slept under my desk in my office so many times that I had no fresh suits left and no time to go to the dry cleaners. And I was pretty cranky. And I remember walking into one of the partners' office, and I worked for two partners, both male, both shorter than me. I'm 5'2.5", soaking wet, and we referred to them as Napoleon I and Napoleon II. Because they had that complex that some, not all, men of small stature have, which is that they felt that they needed to exert their power and authority all the time to make up for their small stature. In all fairness, they were actually pretty good guys. I just hated their guts. And I went into one of the partners' offices in the morning after I had pulled an all-nighter and missed a major family event. And he could tell that I was pissed off. And he looked at me and he said, "Montanaro," because they never called me by my first name, because that would just be way too personal for someone that you work 90 hours a week with, right? "Montanaro, the thing is, you signed up for this. We pay you the big bucks, and you give us the long hours and hard work." What a reality check. He actually handed me a gift if I would unwrap and peel back the layers of that onion, because he was right. This was classic quid pro quo, which is a Latin phrase they use in law all the time. This for that, trade of goods and services. And I did sign up for this, and I could get out. I started going to St. Patrick's Cathedral in Midtown Manhattan. I wasn't very religious. I had already defected from Catholicism at the time. But I felt like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I felt like Quasimodo screaming, "Sanctuary." I would go there to escape. And sometimes the tourists would wake me up because I'd fall asleep in the pews. And when they asked me, "Montanaro, where are you going in the middle of the day?" I'd say to church. And by the way, I was an employment discrimination lawyer. And that was considered a reasonable accommodation to practice my religion. So I was extremely devout. So how did I get out, and what the heck was I going to do? So I was trained in conflict resolution, mediation, facilitative coaching, and career counseling. And yet, none of those really appealed to me. My best friend Tracy and I were on the phone at the time, and we were brainstorming, what could you do, what could you do? And she said, it's really too bad that you can't sort of organize and plan and strategize and help people with their productivity for a living. Wouldn't it be great if that was a real thing that you can get paid for? And we sort of chuckled and hung up. And within an hour, she sent me a link to the National Association of Professional Organizers site. And it wasn't just like a light bulb went off, it was like an explosion in my brain. And I went, people get paid for this? Wow, this is pretty cool. So I marched into my boss's office at the time, but now I was no longer at a firm. I was in-house counsel at a university. And I announced this great idea that I was going to leave my law career and start this business. And he said, "Oh, Lisa, this is a phase you're going through. And you just need to sort of go and get it out of your system. So why don't you work part-time with full benefits?" Well, after I got over the initial shock, and also he changed my thinking, I said, okay, let me try that. And it was, again, a huge gift, because I was able to transition out of the law slowly, build my business, develop a market, develop a client base, get my business plan together, and decide if this was something that I'd be really good at and I'd love doing. But I had some fears. How many of you have fears, right? You know about that? I had three main fears that were really holding me back. And the first one was the fear of financial loss. Remember the background that I came from and all the messages that I was given. And so this really scared the heck out of me that I would give up this six-figure salary with $80,000 in loans and go start this business. And I also had a fear of the perception of friends and family. because many of them at the time were naysayers. They thought I was completely and utterly nuts. And the people that mostly thought I was nuts were other lawyers. And I started to realize over time that they were personalizing and internalizing and then projecting their own fears back onto me. People could smell fear a mile away. So you give them an inch and they take a mile, and they'd be like, Lisa, this is crazy. I mean, you're such a good lawyer. And I mean, the money. And I mean, like, I want you to be happy, but the money. So I decided to do a few things. And one of the first ones is I decided for me that in order to overcome the fear of financial loss, that I had to pay off my student loans first. And I kicked ass. And I paid off $80,000 in student loans, and then saved money on the side as a draw, so that if I failed miserably at this business, I'd have some money and wouldn't go running back to my law career. As far as the friends and family, I started realizing over time that what I needed to do was embrace this change and exude confidence about it, so that they could see that I was totally on board 100%. I also had to stop surrounding myself with the naysayers and started surrounding myself with the believing eyes, as Martha Beck calls them, the famous Harvard negotiator come life coach. And so over time, I started saying, hey, John, are you happy? Do you still love being a lawyer? Yeah, it's the greatest, man. Good, you stay, I'm going. And it became less about them. That's great, I'm glad you're staying, but I'm leaving, and that's not any reflection on you. And over time, people started to get it. My mother was eventually supportive. In the beginning, she was scared, and she said, I'll never forget, she said something to me like, oh, Lisa, but you're so good at being a lawyer. And I thought, well, I could be good at putting little widgets in holes, but I don't do that for a living either. So I've already done this for a while, and I want to try something else. And it wasn't like I did it for a day, folks. I spent 4 years in law school because I went an extra year in order to go in the evening because I was interpreting and teaching during the day. And then I practiced law for 9 years. So we're not talking about someone that just did this on a whim. The other thing was she said to me, what happens if you fail? Do you have a backup plan? And I said, yes. Do you remember that fallback career that you guys told me about? Yeah, I still have that degree. So there it was. And so I left. And what did that look like? It looked like this. I was working in Manhattan, and my office had a view of the Twin Towers. And I had been thinking of leaving, and I was gearing up towards it, and then 9/11 happened. And as for many people in Manhattan, in the world, in the United States, it was a huge catalyst for me. When I would turn around and see that the Twin Towers were gone after that, you could have no better reminder that life is precious and short, and you should go live your life and go do what you need to do. And so I left, finally. It took me 18 months to fully transition out. So I leave and I start this business, and in the beginning, the first incarnation of this business was professional organizing. I actually went into people's homes and office and physically transformed their spaces. After a while, my clients started actually asking me for more things. They started asking me for coaching and consulting and speaking, and I started writing. And so over time, my business morphed and changed. And so I realized something really important as I look back now. The business that you start with is never the business that you wind up with, and actually isn't even the business that you think you're going to have in the middle and in between. So around 2008, I was speaking in Reno, Nevada, and I was speaking actually at the National Association of Professional Organizers conference, and I was awarded the #1 speaker of the conference, which I was very excited about and very proud of. Well, thank you. But in addition to that, they had a talent show. And I want to say it was in a casino, because it was. And there I was in my fishnets, and I did all that jazz from Chicago and won this little talent show with about 200 people in the room. And when I say that my worlds collided, because here were all the people that were coming to hear me speak the next morning in my business suit about how to up-level your business and be a great entrepreneur. And quite a few of them said to me, weren't you the girl last night in the fishnets that did all that jazz? Like while I was standing on stage speaking. Here's why this was a wonderful thing though. From that point on, from 2008 on, I decided that my new brand would be complete and utter transparency. That I would create my purpose and live my passion and bring all those things together. And that has now become my brand. And for those of you that are friends with me on Facebook, you see it. I'll talk one day about working with a client, or doing a speaking engagement, and the next day I'll have my fake eyelashes and fishnets on because I'm doing cabaret at the Davis Musical Theater Company. And so what I think is interesting as we all look back is, for many of us, there is that art that we carry with us our whole lives. I call it our passions. And I'm a multi-passionate person, as I'm sure many of you are. And I think what happens is that when we start a business, we think that we have to compartmentalize our lives. There's our business, and then there's our life and our passion. And for me, I've decided that I'm going to integrate them. And so finally, after trying, to be a Broadway actress, trying to do teaching the deaf, and then being a lawyer, I finally found the platform or vehicle that allows me to be multi-passionate in a way that makes sense. And so I want to ask all of you, if you have that art running through you, whatever that is, and if you're ready to take some type of leap, could you integrate them? Could you add some of your own passions? Could you add your own purpose into your business? If you don't own a business, could you add it into your career more? Because what happens to many of us is we really feel that we have to separate things and that we can't create our purpose and live our passion in one way. And we can. And so what is that big leap that you want to take? Is it starting a business? Is it reinventing your business? I'm always one for change. In fact, my mom used to tease me, Lisa, you should have been a cat because you need 9 lives to do everything that you want to do in this one life. My husband is a veterinarian, and he announced several years ago, after my mother passed away, unfortunately in 2010, we were bike riding through Provence, and he looked at me and he said, what do you need? Anything. And I thought, well, I could use, a glass of wine. And he meant, no, what do you need? Bigger picture. And I said, I actually need a change. I'd like to move from New York. I don't know if that looks like living in Europe for a year or maybe moving someplace warmer, but I could use a change. I think I want to get out of here. And he said to me that he had a dream to do a residency in veterinary internal medicine so he could specialize and become a board-certified diplomat of veterinary internal medicine. And that meant going someplace else because you have to relocate and go to where the teaching hospitals are. So we set out in 2011 and went around the country, and he would interview for his residency positions, and I would do coaching, consulting, or speaking in all these different places in the country. And so what wound up happening was that changed my business model and brand. I stopped my hands-on organizing, and that was really hard for me because that was my baby. That was the way my business started. But I realized that I had outlived and grown out of that brand and that I needed to reinvent my business. So I completely rebranded because I decided when we moved in 2012, 3,600 miles across the country, 13 states, 13 days, 2 dogs in the back, I decided that I wanted to be able to have this business forever. And in order to do that, I needed to go virtual, global, national, and not be stuck in one place. Of course, now here I am in Northern California, and I can't imagine leaving because it's so awesome out here. But it's interesting how, again, the business you start out with is never the business you wind up with. And you reinvent along the way. But I think what's important is you always need to be clear on what your purpose is and what your passion is as you're reinventing. Because if you're not clear on that, you can get lost, especially as an entrepreneur. And so I think it's important to be multi-passionate, but to have your art at the core. And so for all of you, figure out what that art is and make sure that you let it shine. Thank you.